If you feel like you're going flat out all the time at work, at home, everywhere, you're not alone. And while some might advise you to lean in, writer and broadcaster Tara Henley isn't buying it. Her new book explains why. It's called Lean Out, a meditation on the madness of modern life, and it brings Tara Henley to our studio. Welcome back.
Thank
It's very
you.
nice to have you here. Reading this book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is me. Check, 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 check. So the title of your book is in opposition to another well-known book and movement of leaning in. Why did you want to challenge the notion of leaning in by naming your book Leaning Out?
Well, I remember when Lean In came out, and I was working sort of at breakneck speed at my career. I'd been working for a long time. I was feeling very burnt out. I was beginning to be aware of the structural forces that are kind of at play right now in our
What do you mean by
society
that? Like,
that make everything difficult for us, like long working hours and inequality and all of the big forces of our time. And yet, here comes a billionaire woman whose approach to female empowerment is for us all to work harder and longer, and in her case, right up until she gave birth, and then on email from her hospital bed afterwards. And that model just seemed insane to me.
why do you think people bought into that, though?
I think that it is a lot easier to focus on the individual solutions to big problems. I think it's a lot easier to say, if I just take a seat at the table, if I just raise my hand, if I just work harder and be more ambitious, that things will change. Because you have a little bit of control over your own actions. It's a lot harder to say, there are major problems in our society right now that cannot be solved on individual will alone. So as the course of writing the book, I really came to become quite critical of self-help. I used to think it was useful for certain things, but I've really come to believe that it's the wrong tool for our time, that it's actually destructive, because it gives you this idea that it's all on you to fix things, and that if you just work harder and strive more and write more lists and do more inner work, that you can solve these problems. But what we're suffering from right now as a culture can't be solved at an individual level. And so I think that I think we're hitting sort of a critical mass with that at this point in time.
Meaning what?
I think that people are starting to understand that if you are in a job where you're working precarious, you're having a really hard time making your rent. I mean, the numbers right now in Toronto, it's median income is $30,000 a year. Average one bedroom is renting for $2,300 a month. Like, if you are dealing with anxiety and stress and overwork, that is normal when you look at that math. Who wouldn't be feeling anxious? And that meditation is great and yoga is great, but you can meditate all you want. It's not going to change the fact that you're living with that math day in and day out.
I want to read something from your book. And you write, connecting the dots on the epidemic of overwork and anxiety had not led me to unplug from society, leaving a trail of helpful tips for readers in my wake. It had instead led me here to the most pressing issue of our time, inequality. Underlying every single issue that I'd explored was the reality that we live in a massively unequal society. How do you go from leaning out from overwork and then concluding that the root of the issue is income inequality?
So it's funny. I mean, I kind of thought in this book, I was interviewing all these radicals. I figured, oh, I'll probably, like buy a tiny piece of land out in the middle of nowhere and live in a tiny house. Because that's the fantasy, isn't it? When you're working these kind of hours, you just want that break.
And that seems achievable, right?
It does seem achievable. The problem is, first of all, land, even in rural BC right now, is through the roof. So that's actually not a reality for most people. But also, when I looked at the data, when I talked to the experts about what inequality does in terms of our sociology and our biology and our psychology, I really realized that this is the issue that is behind all of it. And part of it has to do with, in the last 30 years, we've undergone a productivity revolution in the business world. We are 70% more productive than we used to be. But for workers, that has been achieved through offshoring, through dynamic scheduling, through precarious work, through layoffs. And so for most people, work has become more accelerated, more stressful, longer hours, and as we mentioned before, wages are stagnant. And so there's a real issue with our day-to-day lives and how much stress is being created.
And something that you wrote that surprised me, correct me if I'm wrong, this was my interpretation of it, that it's not just regular folk who are feeling this stress, that also people who are the 1% feel the stress?
So exactly. So the kind of data on income inequality shows that while the people at the bottom are the most affected in terms of physical health and mental health, the people at the top of the spectrum are also impacted. And so in societies where there's a big gap between the rich and the poor, the rich will be dealing with more mental health issues as well and more physical health issues as well. It affects everyone. We are connected as
Why
a
is
society.
that?
They think it has to do with social stress. And so social stress is one of the biggest stressors on the human body. And so when we get into fight or flight and our body is flooded with cortisol, it sets off a chain reaction in the body. And over time, that can lead to poor physical health and obviously poor mental health as well. And in a society where there's a big gap between the rich and the poor, and there's a lot of tension, everybody feels that tension, including the rich.
Because in my, I guess maybe I have a lack of imagination, I just assume that if you have money, it solves a lot of your problems.
I think if you have money, you have a longer life expectancy, you have better physical health, but it does not save you from being part of a society. And if the society is incredibly dysfunctional, the rich also experience problems as well.
I want to talk again about you, and I hope we can talk about this.
Yeah.
You write about being diagnosed with cancer as a young adult.
Yes.
What impact did that have on you?
It was very life-changing. I was just starting my master's degree. I was 24 years old, and to find out that I had colon cancer was just like devastating to me, and it really did change my life. And part of what happened was I took some time off school because I found that the physical dealing with the surgery and the treatment and everything was one thing, but dealing with the emotions of it was something very different. And to sort of face life or death at 24 it's a very strange thing. And so I took some time off from school to travel because I felt like I just needed to be out in the wider world. And
How did that change your perception of who you are or what was going on with you?
I think it's what made me become a journalist. For one, I was writing a lot while I was away, but also I was doing a lot of interviewing without realizing that I was doing it, talking to people at noodle stands and on buses and everywhere I went, because I was traveling alone, and so everywhere I went, people had a story to tell. And also it was confronting the sort of global inequality as well. And when I had been a teenager, I had been involved in the environmental movement, and I had made a friend who had gone on a world tour. His name is Mutang Tuo, and he was on a world tour to try to stop the logging in his homeland in Sarawak, on the island of Borneo. And we had become friends. He had been a very special person in my life. And when I was sick, I just felt a lot of regret that I had never been able to go and visit him. And
Why?
So I think
Because I would think that when something happens to you, like where you face your death, it was interesting that you were thinking about somebody else and not yourself.
I think when you, or anyways, for me, dealing with those huge emotions of mortality, that it really drove me closer to other people in the end. It was very isolating for a period because you feel quite alone in it. But afterwards, I really felt like, A, I need to live life taking big chances, and B, I want my life to be about love, and that I want to express that, and I want connection, and I want to connect with the people who are super special in my life.
Tell me about the trip to Borneo.
It was wild. So a friend of mine came with me, and we took planes and buses and propeller planes deep into the jungle. And we arrived in this tiny little village in Borneo, in Sarawak. And when we got there, it's about 100 people that live in this village of longhouses. And when we got there, they went to go and get Mutang. I had not seen him in 11 years. And he had had a dream that I was coming, and so the village was expecting
Waiting for
us.
you.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and it still blows my mind.
When you were staying with them, they opened their homes to you. You slept
Yeah.
with them.
Yeah.
You shared the food that they had, the little food that they had. What did
Yeah.
that community illustrate in terms of what was happening globally?
It threw me back into sort of an ancient way of relating. I mean, we have not always lived in cities alone in climate-controlled condos, right? And for most of history, we lived the way that Mutong still lives, you know, with a group of maybe 30 to 100 people where you would basically do anything for those people. And you express your care by sharing what you have. You feed each other, you care for each other, you defend each other, you shelter each other. And in that real generosity of being treated that way, I really came to understand what is missing in our society. And
What is that?
it's that tribal communal life, that feeling of giving and receiving, of really taking care of each other.
You write in the book about how the way that cities are designed promote social isolation,
Yeah.
which is not something I would think of. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I talked to a really amazing city planner in Vancouver who writes about this at length. But if you think about what's getting built these days, it's one-bedroom condos. And it is one-bedroom condos that really don't have any place to entertain at all. And so your life really becomes going to work and coming home and sleeping in your condo by yourself. And, you know, I interviewed another author for the book, Sebastian Younger, who wrote a book actually called Tribe. And his analysis, he is a trained anthropologist and became a war correspondent. And when he came back from the war, he experienced PTSD and started really thinking deeply about the mental health issues that soldiers have. And what he came to believe is that it wasn't so much the frontline combat that was giving them post-traumatic stress. It was the society that they returned home to because it was so isolated and so fragmented. And they, of course, had been living tribally while they were at war.
Because their lives depended on each other and they operated as a unit.
Exactly.
And then when you come back to our world, everything is very individual.
Yeah, you go to your job, you probably don't talk to anyone on the subway, you go to bed at night, maybe with your spouse, maybe by yourself.
You also write in the book, if we're honest about it, if we look at the actual numbers, overwork essentially is taking all of our precious life energy, all the hours we could be spending with family, laughing with friends, learning new hobbies, getting out into nature, exercising our bodies, eating home-cooked meals, sleeping, participating in our communities, and creating real social change, and converting all of that time and energy and attention into profit. Profit, in fact, for a very small group of people. So we're working for less and we're making more profit for the employers. What other ripple effects are we feeling on a personal level?
Well, we know that anxiety and depression are way up. We know that community involvement is way down. There's all kinds of ripple effects all through society. And I think it's time to start sort of questioning, I mean, if I work an extra 10 or 15 unpaid overtime hours a week, that is generating value for somebody else. But what cost does that come at to me? What does that mean for my health? What does that mean for my community? What does that mean for my relationships?
Do you think people have time to think about this stuff, or are people just going in like a loop?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people are experiencing what I was experiencing before I was forced to take a break. Exactly like you said, that loop of get up, go to work, next, all the time.
How do you see the current state of modern life and income inequality? How do you see that impacting women?
I think, well, we know that the pay gap still exists, of course, but I also think that we're hearing a lot about Gen X women in particular right now. I just interviewed an author last week on this. And
Ada Calhoun?
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, it's funny, she's talking about all of us being up at 4 in the morning and can't sleep, and the night before I interview, I'm up at 4 in the morning, I can't sleep. I mean, we have so many things coming at us all at once. And in some ways, what's one of our strengths, and in that we're the glue that holds society together. If I have a friend who has a baby, I'm going to make a casserole and take it over. If I have a friend who's sick, I'm going to go do her laundry. As a woman, though, when you are parenting and in your community and working in the super competitive workplace and struggling, trying to make ends meet with rents going way high. All of those forces coming together, I think, are impacting women maybe slightly more than men at this point in time. And so I think women are the canary in the coal mine about all of this.
So you moved to Vancouver. In the book, you write
did.
about your leaving Toronto
Yes.
and then going to Vancouver.
Yes.
How did that change your perspective on what was happening with you?
I was so shocked when I arrived back in Vancouver. I had grown up in Vancouver. I had assumed that I could have maybe a little bit more relaxed life there. But when I got there, the housing crisis was so extreme that it was, it took 7 weeks to find a livable apartment. I was suddenly paying half of my take-home pay in rent. It was a lot harder to make a living out there than it is in Toronto. Just the actual structural systemic forces. But what concerned me most was how much it was dividing society.
In what ways?
So, some of my friends who had money for down payments, their houses had gone through the roof in terms of equity, and so their experience of the city was very, very different than people who were renting. And it's split basically down the middle in Vancouver in terms of who rents and who owns, about half and half each. And so the friends that had not had money for down payments were living in crumbling apartment blocks that were poorly maintained, trying to raise families in basically the same apartments they'd launched their adult lives in. And so there was just an incredible amount of social tension and rage. And
how does that rage play out?
you would see it in traffic a lot,
right.
a lot in traffic, yeah. And of course on social media.
Right. I'd like to ask you to read something from your book.
Yes.
Could you read this passage for us?
Yes. Profound healing is possible, probable even, under the right conditions. But in order to foster these conditions, we have to stop telling the story of healing as one of individual triumph and start acknowledging the role of the tribe. We have to focus on what we must do for each other instead of what we must do for ourselves.
That kind of goes against the grain of what we're conditioned to do nowadays. Because so much of our modern life is pulling people from being away from each other and community living. So how do we buck these trends?
So I think the first thing to do is to recognize that we need to buck the trends and to really understand that we are social, communal, tribal people, and that our whole biology is hardwired for that. Like, you can tell how lonely someone is by how many micro awakenings they have in the night. And they think that's because we evolved on the savannas of Africa, and if you were separated from your tribe, you would have to be hypervigilant and wake up every few minutes, every half an hour to make sure that you were safe. So our biology is hardwired for that, and yet we're walking around in these very alienating, isolating cultures. And I think for me, the story in the book that drives home that quote so much about healing, about the healing I saw around me and also the healing I experienced was a man named Shaka Senghor.
Can you tell me about him?
Yeah, so in the course of the research for the book, I came across his story. I wanted to interview him. I tracked him down. I went to his house in LA, and one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever met. And so his story is this. He grew up in Detroit, really smart guy, honor roll student as a kid. And as he was growing up, his neighborhood was quite stable, middle-class black neighborhood. And as white flight started happening and crack came in, the neighborhood started to fall apart, and his parents' marriage ended, and his mother had been physically abusive. After their separation, that abuse escalated and he had to leave the home. So here he is, he's a 14-year-old honor roll student who wants to be a doctor, and he thinks, I'm sure someone else's parents will take me in, I'm a good kid.
And no one does.
And no one takes him in, and so the drug dealers take him in. And so he, of course, experienced everything that comes with that.
He was shot at 14?
He was shot at 17.
17.
Yeah, so 14, he becomes a drug dealer. He's shot at 17. He gets post-traumatic stress, starts carrying a gun, and right before his 19th birthday, he shoots the gun and ends a life and goes to prison.
And he goes to prison for many years. And he was in isolation for about 7 years?
Yes, exactly.
How did he turn his life around?
So this was the most amazing thing, is the way he talks about his healing is about all the people who intervened. So there was a man in the prison who was on staff who was incredibly influential to Shaka, whose wife worked in publishing, and she used to bake cookies and send them into the inmates. And when Shaka started writing for the prison newsletter, this man took his writing to his wife. And she sent a message back into the prison saying, "You're an amazing writer, keep going." And he said that sort of being acknowledged as a human being for something really positive was life-changing for him. There were also, his father was very influential in his life. Other inmates were influential in his life. He talked to me about starting a program in the prison for men.
And he's actually connected to former President Barack Obama.
He is. So he comes out of jail.
Yeah.
He becomes a community activist. He writes a New York Times best-selling book, and he works with Obama. Yeah.
What a turnaround.
Yeah, MIT Media Lab fellow now.
So this is a reminder that the individual is stronger when supported by a community.
It always, that he was given the tools that he needed for healing by being surrounded by a community. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you wrote the book. I think it's going to help a lot of people. I've marked it up so much. It's helped me. So thank you so much, Tara.
Thank you, Nam.
It's been a pleasure having you here.
So nice to be here. Thanks, Nam.
Tara, it's really nice to see you again. So, since the last time we spoke, big changes. Your book is about the madness of modern life. Has the pandemic changed anything you wrote about in the book, Lean Out?
I think what the pandemic has really done is highlighted the systemic forces that I was really trying to unpack in the book. So,
When you say
things like,
systemic forces, what do you mean?
well, I'm talking about precarious work. I'm talking about income inequality, so the gap between the rich and the poor. I'm talking about the housing crisis. I'm talking about poor transportation. All of those issues were incredibly pressing before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, they have really been revealed to be incredibly, incredibly pressing forces, and have really been behind a lot of the kind of inequality distribution of the pandemic that we have seen. And so I think the awareness for these issues has really increased.
Do you think, because I think as a society, we do talk about people living in bubbles, but do you think that because of what the pandemic has revealed, how little control we have over our day-to-day doings, do you think that people have become more aware of the inequality?
I think so. I think that people are really starting to understand how connected we are, because the pandemic is so biological, and because we're seeing how the health of us as individuals is impacted by the health of everybody around us. I think we're starting to get a much, much greater understanding of how impacted we are as a society when we allow that inequality to run rampant as it has for decades now.
Does it make you, how does it make you feel to know that it's taken a pandemic for us to see how unequal our society is?
Mm. I mean, I have a range of emotions about all of this. I find it very difficult, as I'm sure most thinking and feeling people do, to see so much suffering. I think, reporting on this pandemic has been just really difficult on an emotional level. I am hopeful, however, because I'm seeing so many instances where there are such radical shifts in the way that we're thinking and the way that we're behaving, and the kinds of changes that are coming out of this pandemic. Of course, it's too early to see where this will all go, but personally, I do feel hopeful.
Well, one of the themes in your book was about how much we do in a day and how we're always going and going and going. And now there are memes on the internet, people saying, what day is today? We should just get rid of days because the days of the week have become meaningless. Do you think that this madness of everything always being so fast has been diminished because we have all this time to stay at home, or it's been intensified?
I think it probably depends on where you sit in sort of the distribution of jobs and wealth and all of that. I know that those of us who have been able to work at home have had a different kind of time working. We've had more time to contemplate, more time to think deeply. Things have slowed down. The schedule has gotten less intense, but there are people working in grocery stores and, of course, on the front lines, and cleaners whose lives have gotten much, much more intense and more busy. So I think it really depends on where we sit on that scale. And but I do think even with those discrepancies, what I'm hearing over and over and over again is that people at all levels of society are beginning to think really, really deeply about how we organize our society.
Do you think that the fact that people now realize how it is on the other side, maybe people are able to see each other more clearly, do you think that this will help to lead to maybe change policies that are in effect right now?
I think that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, definitely the big question. One of the things I think about a lot is the grocery store workers. We have seen grocery store workers really behave in quite courageous and heroic ways throughout the pandemic. Especially in the early pandemic when there was so little information about the virus, these workers were in many ways risking their lives to go to work to keep society functioning, to make sure that we were fed. And there was a wide scale understanding and appreciation that that was what was taking place. And so I guess the big question is, when you understand that a worker is essential and you understand the role that they play in society is crucial, does that translate into a livable wage for these workers? And these are questions that we're going to see playing out, I think, for many years to come. I think a lot about World War II in this context of how, people having lived through that sort of disaster moment and seeing that radical paradigm shift and seeing society come together in ways that it had not before, that did translate into public policy changes for decades to come. Will it this time? That is definitely an open question and a very important one.
Tara, we appreciate your time and thank you for writing this book. I think now more than ever, it's important to read this book and for us to rethink how we move forward post COVID-19. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Nam, and nice to see you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario, and by viewers like you. Thank you.